Interested in all things psychology? You are at the right place. Here, we bring exciting and thought-provoking ideas. We travel into our minds and some things out of this world. Welcome to the Psychology Debrief.
Hello and welcome to the Psychology Debrief. I'm your host, Sam Fairlamb, and today we're talking about life in space. I'm joined today by Dr. Elisa Ferre, whose research focuses on gravity and how that contributes to human behaviour and cognition, as well as her PhD candidate, Iqra Arshad, whose work is focusing on decision-making in altered gravity environments. Thank you both of you for joining me and taking some time out today to talk about your research area. It sounds really fascinating. How are you both doing?
Thank you very much, Sam, and hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. We are doing well. It's rather nice and hot in London, which is very nice.
Yeah, so I mean, for those of you who don't realize, we're recording this on a heat wave in the middle of July, and I am going to probably sweat by the end of this because if I have the fan on, no one will hear me, and so seeing drips of sweat is probably the expense of what we get at.
So this is the real challenge, not space flight.
Yeah, well, to be honest, I mean, the area of your research and understanding is probably going to be the real challenge here. I mean, sweat is probably just an additional layer of complexity to the whole problem. Now, when we deal with this idea of life in space, now, most of the time when we think about space, I immediately think this is a physics issue, right? This isn't something we deal with in psychology, but clearly that's not the case. And in fact, actually, Elisa, I believe you went on a commercial space flight. I don't know whether it was with Jeff Bezos or Richard Branson and any of those flights, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about what it was like experiencing weightlessness.
Sure. Well, let me just clarify that I didn't manage yet to go to a commercial space flight. This is something that is brand new. It's actually last week that we could see the first ever commercial suborbital space flight from Richard Branson, who successfully experienced 6 beams of microgravity during the flight. And that was the first commercial one ever. I have been into parabolic flight. That is another way to simulate altered gravity here on Earth. So during a parabolic flight, as the name suggests, the plane is doing some parabolas. And during the maneuver, then both hypergravity and microgravity can be elicited. Now, what does it mean, hyper and microgravity? Hypergravity means plus terrestrial gravity. So whatever gravity is above the 1g terrestrial gravity that we experience on Earth, while microgravity is essentially weightlessness. So zero gravity, no gravity at all. And during the parabolic flight, you can experience both during the parabola. So essentially you have a first acceleration in which there is a lot of gravity, hypergravity, and then 20 seconds of microgravity experience. And then again, another deceleration to hypergravity phase. Now, during the microgravity experience, well, you asked me to describe that. Well, yeah. It's the best thing ever. It's just the best thing ever. I think it's emotional, it's very difficult to describe. It's very difficult to use some words to describe that. So suddenly you have no more constraints. So your body is free to move in the 360 environment. There's no longer up, down, left, right, no constraints. There's no weight. You don't experience any weight and you start floating around. So yes, the best thing ever, but also the most difficult thing ever, because it's not easy for our body, it's not easy for our brain to cope with that. So I did also experience the worst motion sickness in my life.
Yeah, and I suspect that a lot of this we're going to elaborate on in a second when we talk more about the research that you do. But before we kind of get into that, I thought maybe it was quite good to have a little bit of a brainstorm about other ways in which psychology can add to this issue of understanding space. And, for example, your work focuses on gravity, but, what other ways in which life in space or traveling into space can psychology have an impact? I don't know if either of you have any suggestions, maybe research areas that you're familiar with, perhaps.
So when we talk about human spaceflight, we are talking about a rather recent field. I mean, it's not so far that we went in terms of space exploration. We have been to the moon. We are now established on the International Space Station. But, space can be much more distance and much more challenging. For instance, deep space mission to Mars. Now, dealing with space is not easy because it's clearly an hostile environment. And it's not only hostile in terms of the physics of this outer space environment, it's also about the distance, being isolated and be very far from home, alone or with people that you might have not known until a few months before. So there are different aspects that I think psychology should help us in order to improve and go even farther in space exploration. And those aspects so far has been not so much explored, if I may. There was a lot of advantages. Sorry, I need to repeat. There was a lot of progress in terms of technology in order to go into space, but the human factor was perhaps a little bit neglected, and the psychological related factors have been quite a lot neglected. So we need to look into that when we start to plan mission to Mars on going back and establish the lunar habitat.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously in kind of popular sort of psychology, we sort of, I mean, not popular psychology, but popular culture in movies, we often see, you know, these kind of space flights where, you know, these individuals struggle with well-being, but that's a genuine problem, right? That can occur when you, as you mentioned, so far away from home, often so isolated with very few people around you. I'm going to just throw one into the mix as well. I'm going to go down a sci-fi route here and say that when we meet alien life, and I'm going to say when, because it's seeming from various other disciplines in science that, you know, life may be more abundant than we think, and potentially intelligent life may not be as far away as we might think, or will at least exist somewhere. That's going to have some serious ramifications upon group relations, which is my area of psychology. I think one thing, you know, obviously we'll be trying to understand how we relate to other intelligent life forms. So I think that's going to be, maybe I should just start writing some papers now and just keep them to a side until when, you know, whenever the US or whatever decides to tell us we have met intelligent life, I can just churn them all out and go, I've got them already. Iqra, I think maybe you had a suggestion of maybe other ways in which psychology can inform the kind of space debate.
I mean, just to touch on your point about the alien space invasion and us meeting them, I think there will be an element of jealousy if we do see them. You know, we are humans, we're selfish, we like to, you know, be special and all of this kind of stuff. So maybe when we do see these aliens, suddenly there's this jealousy, suddenly there's this fight or flight response, and we all go a little bit crazy, and this in-out group kind of dynamics. Maybe you know more about that than I do. But yeah, I want to touch, no, sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I think you're totally right. I think that it will, you know, psychologically, I think really be impactful to us. You know, we did this in an earlier podcast about whether humans are really unique. And I think that if we came across other intelligent life forms that suggest that our capabilities are not so unique, I think that would be quite, I think something that psychologically some people would struggle to cope with. So I think it's a great point.
I think even if we look at AI and, you know, what robots do now and, you know, Boston Dynamics and all these kind of things, we still, you know, we do feel a little bit like, are we special? Are we, you know, unique in any way? Because they can do exactly what we can do. They can learn, you know, things much faster, much quicker. Their memory is exceptional. You know, we do kind of question ourselves in that sense. But yeah, on the emotional point, you know, we've seen in COVID isolation how much people have struggled and how difficult it has been for people who have been in lockdown and experiencing those kind of things. And here on Earth, we have connections, you know, instant connections with millions and millions of people, you know, Facebook, WhatsApp, all these live sessions. We've had so much interaction, yet people really felt down and they felt stressed, they felt isolated, they felt, you know, confined to their homes. So we can only imagine what kind of things go through astronauts' minds and how much they struggle. And especially because there's this massive delay in communication, which we don't experience on Earth. So it's really stressful for them. And then you combine the dynamics of workload and, you know, the kind of work that they're doing on International Space Station and all the other things. It's really difficult for them. And we do need to appreciate how highly trained and specialized they are.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm convinced that, you know, psychology is clearly impactful here in this realm, although I think on, you know, normal sort of thought processes, you think this is the realm of physics and so forth, but I think psychology really, the human factor is really important. So I'm convinced, obviously, you both focus on the impact that gravity has. So let's get into more of that kind of content. But before we do, I have a bit of a thing that I need to confess, which is I'm not very good with neuroscience, and I know where this is going, and I'm very, very nervous because as a student, I really, really struggled with neuroscience. And I think the first thing that I enjoyed when I finished my undergraduate degree was thinking, I never have to think about those things again. And now I realize when I decided to set up this podcast that I've accidentally pushed myself back down to neuroscience. So I'm going to just request that you both be very gentle with me in the next 25 minutes or so, because this is going to be a very difficult thing for me to try and grasp.
So can we start by asking you to describe the structure of the neuron and go into details, just to make you happy with the discussion?
We could, but I feel like that it would be more informative to listen to a 5-year-old than me trying to describe the neurons. So I think let's just skip those sections and go straight to you giving your expertise rather than me pretending I know things about neuroscience. So I think first of all, probably the best place to start is obviously Elisa. Obviously your work concerns, how there's brain structural changes and cognition changes as well when we are in sort of what altered gravity or weightlessness. So perhaps maybe you can just describe some of these actual behavioral changes and brain changes that occur.
Yeah, so let's talk very, very, very briefly about the physics. So here on Earth, we have 1g gravitational acceleration, which is the attraction of the planet towards, to the center of our planet that is on all the objects, our body and brain as well. So that means that all our bodily physiology works very well with this 1g force that is attracting us toward the center of the planet. As soon as you remove this 1g force, means that the bodily physiology need to readjust to zero gravity, so to the absence of this 1g force on the body and on the brain. Now, the first thing that happens is that all the fluids start to shift toward the head. And this is essentially physics. So the 1g acceleration is no longer there, there's no longer gravity, and therefore the fluids start to go up. Now, the fluids that are going up are nicely going to the head, and that means that they are nicely, well, kind of, compressing the brain toward the skull. And therefore, we can start to see some structural changes in the brain. There is much more fluid there, which means that this fluid can push towards the ocular nerve, which can make people see very blurred and not perfectly when they are in zero gravity environment. Now, it's not possible to do neuroimaging in zero gravity. We don't have a fMRI that is portable on the International Space Station.
Yes.
So what people have done so far is looking at brain structural changes before and after being in outer space. And what has been shown is that, yes, there are changes in the structure, there are changes in the connectivity between different brain areas. And most of these structural and connectivity changes are related to neurovestibular impairment. So the vestibular system, which is inside our inner ear, is the sensory modality that codes for gravitational signal. It can tell immediately to the brain where is your heading function of gravity. And as soon as people are in outer space, the vestibular system gets a little bit crazy, gravity is no longer there, and it looks like that the brain change are related to this vestibular misfunctioning. So we can see difference in the structure of the ventricles and other brain areas, but also in the connectivity between the core vestibular areas and the other brain areas. And this has been shown in astronaut studies pre-post-flight. Now, how this is going to be reflected in cognition? This is a little bit of an open question, because of course, in the current model of human space exploration, we have astronauts which are very well trained and they can cope with altered gravity experience. How a naive standard brain can adjust to altered gravity environment, I think that this is an open question. But nevertheless, in astronauts, we also see cognitive changes. I mentioned before motion sickness. This is called space adaptation syndrome, which can affect up to 80% of astronauts, which essentially means that they are getting very, very sick in the first hours, days, and even weeks after being in outer space. So motion sickness, not only nausea and not only vomiting, but also being disoriented, being with the so-called brain fog, not making sure about movement around the environment, very poor visual spatial coordination, oculomotor coordination as well as perceptual changes. I always like an example from an astronaut who say that suddenly they were looking at a watch that was floating in the environment. So this was happening overnight. So they could see a watch that was floating in the environment, and it took several minutes for them to realize that the watch was actually attached to their wrist. So they could see this watch, but they were kind of not understanding that their wrist was floating in the environment. And now, this is just a quote from an astronaut, but gives you the idea about the disconnection between the actual experience and the awareness of it.
Yeah, and I guess something that, although I think maybe you hinted at the answer that I was wondering in my head, was you mentioned obviously we can check pre and post flight. And you mentioned that sometimes some of these effects seem to last sort of several weeks, perhaps. So we're not talking about sort of very temporary changes. It may have potentially long-term, or does it eventually, is there studies that show it goes back to kind of baselines or the normal effects?
So the data that we can see so far, as I say, in astronauts, so very well-trained subjects, are that it takes a little bit of time for the brain to adjust. It can eventually adjust, but it takes time. So you can see perhaps slightly low performance and physiological consequences immediately when they are in altered gravity. Then they recover, the performance goes back to normal, let's say. But as soon as they are back here on Earth again, there is some sort of impairment, because again, the brain needs to readjust to a different gravity load. Now, I think we can go back to the first question during the podcast, which was about the challenges of space flight and why psychology is important. Well, think about deep space mission in which you have many different transition of G load, gravity load, during the mission, and you're also very far. How you're going to cope with them? I think that's something that psychology can really help in improving human performance during space flight.
Yeah, definitely.
Even if you, even if you're on YouTube and stuff, you can, Google these videos and watch them. You see these astronauts, as soon as they return, they're just falling all over the place because they have no clue where they are.
And I would recommend to do so, but not just yet. Please finish listening to this recording and then go and listen to those other YouTube videos. But that's a great suggestion. Actually, Iqra, just to call on you then, obviously looking sort of based on what Elisa's just said about these kind of changes in the brain, how clear are the understanding of these effects do we have? Is it quite clear to you guys as researchers in this area what those changes are? I know that I think you've got some work that you're currently looking to publish around this sort of question. So I'm just sort of wondering how clear our understanding of these issues actually are at the moment.
I mean, to simply put it, it's not clear at all. We really don't know what's happening. We really don't know what's going on to the brain and why these changes are happening. And I know Elisa mainly focused on the brain, but I also want to mention there's a lot of changes that happen to your eyes as well. So a lot of the time when these astronauts return from space, their eyes remain damaged for a long period of time, more than 10, 12 years. So if you can imagine, not only do you suffer brain changes, but visual changes as well. You're struggling with posture, you're struggling with, everyday interaction with the environment. Suddenly it has a massive impact on how you function as a human being. And yeah, we are working on a recent paper where we are discussing, the research from the last 10 years in spaceflight research. And we're looking at, what are the effects of altered gravity, what kind of implications it has on the body, on sensory motor functioning, on cognition, on emotion, on social interaction. So it's a really, a broad paper that we're looking at, just trying to outline what's going on, because really nobody understands and nobody, can come up with a conclusion about what's going on. But we also have to remember that it's incredibly difficult to create any sort of altered gravity environment on Earth, because on Earth, 1G is constantly present. So we have to come up with clever ways of how we do our research. And like Elisa mentioned, with a parabolic flight, that's one method people use. Others use things like centrifuges, isolation studies. So there's quite a broad range of methods that are used. And because of that, we don't have this systematic knowledge. We don't have this systematic understanding. And a lot of the time, the participant groups are also pretty biased. So they tend to be young people, predominantly male, predominantly white. The group sample sizes tend to be pretty small. And other times they tend to be astronauts who are, taking part in these pre and post flight sort of experiments. So our knowledge is very limited and very confined, I would say. And there's a lot of, issues we have with replication, with standardized methods. A lot of it is qualitative work, which, sorry, Sam, I know you love your qualitative side of things, but sometimes we do need a quantitative approach about, exactly what's going on and what kind of effects it has. So yeah, we don't understand a lot.
Yeah, and obviously you brought me really to my next kind of query, which was, obviously you mentioned it's very difficult to kind of experimentally look at some of these issues on Earth because of the basic law principle that we have 1G all around us, right? So I guess I know that you guys do a lot of laboratory work. I sometimes walk past your door and see that you're up to some amazing experiments. So take me through. Imagine that I've just now signed up to be a guinea pig in one of your experiments. What would you have me do? What kind of, give me a paradigm or a way in which you can try and then test the influences or the effects of gravity on me? What would you have me do as a participant?
Good question. So let's say that you have signed up for one of our studies, then probably you're going to be tested in one of three different scenarios, let's say. We use a lot a tilting table in which we can place participant upright or in the so-called head down bed rest position, which means -6 degrees from the supine posture. So the head is slightly below the feet. Now, this has been shown to mimic the effect of microgravity, and in particular, it can trigger altered vestibular gravitational signal. So in our lab, we are really interested in altered vestibular gravitational signal, not gravity in general. We are not interested in this movement of fluids or so on. We are very interested in about what's happening to the vestibular system. So this tilting table and placing participants at different orientation is very good to trigger different vestibular signals. So you might have signed up for this type of experiment, or you might have signed up for another experiment in which we use virtual reality. So now virtual reality is very powerful. I'm not sure whether you have tried. It's cool. It's a lot of fun. But it's also very interesting in terms of a method because the brain can be easily tricked by virtual reality environment. Now, there is something going on in virtual reality, which is called visual capture, which means that if you're not really moving around, then it's quite easy to make the brain believe that you are in the environment that you perceive with your eyes. So we normally fix the head of our participant in a nice, comfortable way. And then we ask them to wear the head mounted display, and we show them some gravity-related visual cues that are coherent with terrestrial gravity or non-terrestrial gravity, such as Mars. And then we can look into perception and motor control and even decision-making while participant is wearing this virtual reality setup. Or you might also sign up for another type of experiment in which we use direct vestibular stimulation. In this type of experiments, we have electrode on the mastoid, which is the bone behind the ear. The vestibular nerve is rather superficial at that level, and we can inject current into the vestibular nerve in order to alter vestibular functioning. Now, I know that these look a little bit Frankenstein, but it's totally safe, and it's actually quite a nice experience. So yes, you can come through these three different methods. Sometimes we do also combine them, but essentially this is what we are using. And I think that linking my answer to what Iqra mentioned before, there are some biases, or there are in general some limitations in current space research. Sample size, white male, very high trained participants. What we are interested in the lab is to get rid of these limitations and biases by combining both space methods, parabolic flight, centrifuges, and even head-down bed rest studies with traditional neuroscience methods in the lab. So then we can have much larger sample sizes. We can control different variables, and we can also test naive participants, which I think is very, very interesting to see how a naive brain reacts to altered gravity rather than a very well-trained one.
Yeah, I mean, I found it really interesting that one of the ways that you can do this is through virtual reality. I never would have necessarily expected that that was a method that you could deploy, but actually it kind of makes a lot of sense that, through these kind of technological advancements, that we can trick the brain into thinking something that's not really, I guess, happening, and then that can give you an insight or a way to examine these issues. But obviously, as you noted, there are obviously limitations to these. I just wanted to pick up more on the one that sounds a bit like a torture, one that I read in a torture book before, where you kind of hang somebody upside down. I believe Iqra, the kind of what's called the sort of head down bed rest, I think is what you mentioned. Iqra, I believe you're trying to utilize this as well as virtual reality to look at these kind of altered responses in your PhD. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. But I do want to say it's nothing like torture. Just think of it as being in your bed and just being tilted upside down. It's a very pleasurable, nice experience. No torture being involved. Absolutely not.
Yeah.
You are strapped by your feet just to make sure you don't fall down, but that's it.
So if you could go and elaborate on precisely what these altered responses are that you're trying to look at when you're using these paradigms.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Elisa said, we don't have a systematic approach to space research, and that's really what we want to do in the lab and trying to find out. So in one of our experiments, we were using something called the oddball task. I don't know, Sam, if you are familiar, but for those who aren't, it's a task where you hear a stream of sounds. So there could be, say, a low-pitched beat, a constant sound, and then with occasional target sound, which in our case was a high-pitched beat. And so every time you hear this odd sound, hence the name oddball task, you just press, a space bar or a key response to say, yes, I've heard it. And why do you think it's important? Well, we need to respond to our environment. We need to be able to, detect changes, respond to them in a really quick, way. And of course, in space, that's absolutely crucial when you are, so far away. And if you have things buzzing at you or beeping at you, you need to be able to respond to them. So what we did in the lab was, we have participants tilting on our lovely tilt table, no torture involved. They were just tilting in 3 different positions. So the first position was upright, so, like they were standing, and then at a 45 degrees tilt, and then a 90 degrees tilt. And what we found was when participants were tilted in the 45 degrees, their performance in terms of reaction time was much worse. So they were taking longer to respond. And just by altering this tiny thing of, changing body posture, we found this increase in reaction time, and it was absolutely fascinating. So then we moved on, and then we wanted to explore this further by changing visual cues. So we changed what participants were seeing. In this task, people were just sat on their laptops, passively viewing a virtual reality simulation of Earth and Mars. So they just saw the Earth, in the background with a ball falling at a constant 1g gravity, and then they also saw a condition of Mars gravity, again, this ball falling to Mars gravity. And while they were passively viewing it, they were performing the oddball task. Again, we found that just by them passively viewing this in the background, they were slower at the oddball responses. So the reaction times were increased. So not only just changing vestibular cues by tilting participant increase reaction time, but also by changing visual cues by them, passively watching Mars, they again have this increase in reaction time, which suggests that this internal model of gravity, it uses cues from vestibular and visual input, and anything that challenges it leads to some sort of delay or, incoherence in responding.
Yeah, and I mean, that sounds, like really important to realize, because as you noted, when you're in space, I mean, often you're probably dealing with very complex technology. You may be dealing with often the need to react very fast to things. It can, it's not like Earth where, there's maybe you could make mistakes and it's not so bad. I guess in those situations, it can be life or death. So it's really important to understand those sort of issues. I'm just wondering as well, is there any other kind of, I believe maybe there's some sort of suboptimal decision making as well that people might make when experiencing the effects of altered gravity as well?
Yeah, so similar to head down bed rest, we use another method where we just, without any torture, without any pain, we just ask participants to stand upright against a wall, and then also just to lie down on the floor. So on the floor, not on any machine or device. We just get them to lie down. And what this does is while you're lying down, your vestibular cues are incongruent to gravity. So they create some sort of conflict. And what we found on a different task, so this was the random number generation task, is when participants have to randomly respond, they just say, numbers randomly from 1 to 9, that they were much worse when they were lying down compared to upright. So what do I mean by much worse? So they were saying the same numbers again and again when they were lying down compared to when they were upright, they were being more random. So on this simple cognitive task, again, we see people failing just by them being supine and lying down. So we can see this, that vestibular signaling is absolutely crucial to our cognition and how we respond and interact with things in the environment and to changes to it.
So then I'm kind of wondering, because I mean, all this sounds really, really important. So I'm kind of wondering in your position then, what can you do to maybe advise space agencies and say Richard Branson on his commercial space flights? Like, what can we do therefore to bring to the table to say, or have we not quite reached that point yet where we know how maybe we can kind of overcome or counter some of these, what seem to be potentially problematic effects?
I think that once again, we are going back to your initial question about why psychology. And I think that psychology needs to be in the big picture of space exploration and commercial space flight. So not only physical training, not only instruments and operation related training, but also psychological training and cognitive training might be helpful. It might be helpful in the moment in which there's no direct communication with ground control. So now there is a direct communication in terms of all operations that astronauts are doing into the ISS. So if this is no longer possible because of delay in communication, let's say astronauts on Mars, or perhaps even on Moon, then people need to be aware that there might be suboptimal decision making or suboptimal reaction and try to overcome them. So probably much more teamwork, but not ground astronauts communication based interaction. So a little bit more independence and teamwork while they are in the mission rather than astronauts ground work.
Yeah, I would say that until we really clearly understand what the effects of anti-gravity are, we can't really come up with really effective countermeasures. So there's this cycle where we need to really understand what's going on, where are the deficits, and then from there move on to what countermeasures can be developed. And we need to be very specific in our approach and develop very good theories and models and a priori hypotheses, have clear flexible methods and have a collaborative approach. A lot of researchers, they work in isolation, and it's until we have this multidisciplinary cross-national kind of approach, we won't get to this point where we can make effective countermeasures which will help astronauts when they are in deep space, or even humans when they are in these lovely commercial space flights.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all of this has been super fascinating. I mean, for me, I think I would take away 3 real key messages. Number 1 seems to be your methods are certainly not torture, and you've convinced me. I'm signing up to your next experiment. So if you ever want to make me come and do some gravity stuff, then come knock on my door. Number 2 is that there's this real kind of interface between all these disciplines of science, right? So back to what Elisa said right at the beginning about just understanding kind of physics. So the ideas of sort of 1G, and then obviously then that leads to how those how physics therefore affects our bodies, and then how it affects our behavior. And I think that's something which often we kind of forget. When we deal with psychology, we deal with it as a kind of compartmentalized issue, which is separate from other aspects of science. And number 3 is that it seems to me that there's a real big important part that psychology plays, not obviously just in necessarily the research that you do, but also just more generally the large problems that space flight can lead to, and what psychology can bring to the table. I'm just wondering maybe if there are any final thoughts that either of you have that you also think I should be leaving on.
I would highlight again what Iqra said before about multidisciplinary effort. We should not work in isolation. We should consider human space flight as a real challenge, not only in terms of technology, not only in terms of technological improvement, rockets, rocket science, but also in terms of human performance. Because you can have the best rocket ever, but if the human performance is not so good, then you're going to have problem anyway. So it really needs to be a coordinated multidisciplinary effort. And also, we also need to think about human space flight in terms of opportunities for life on Earth. It's not only about, okay, it's a challenge to go in outer space. It's also about what can we learn from human space flight that can help life on Earth. Now, we have briefly mentioned some of the physiological changes that are happening to the body during spaceflight. We have focused much more on the neuroscience bits, but there is also bone loss, problem in the muscles, visual impairment, hormonal changes, and so on, which really remind to aging. So being in outer space means being on a fast race towards aging, and we can potentially use that model in order to develop drugs, intervention that then can be exploited here on Earth. So consider the space as a multidisciplinary and impact platform rather than just let's go and explore.
And Iqra, what's your final remark? What's the kind of key thing that you think people should take away?
Well, I think sometimes maybe we also need to take a step back from the science, and we just need to pause and appreciate, how amazing is it that we live on Earth, that we have this environment, that we have the atmosphere, we have the plants, we have sun, we have, all these amazing things. We have humans capable of, developing rockets to go through to other, planets and Mars and what have you. I think we just need to stop also and just appreciate life and how lucky we are.
I think that's a really nice point to end on as well. So I'd like to thank both of you for taking up the time today to talk a little bit about your research. We do have a little bit of time left for a bit of a quiz. So if you don't mind, I'd like to now, after being grilled on my understanding of neuroscience, like to put you to the test with a quiz of my own. Now, how are you both with your knowledge on phobias? I'm assuming probably very limited. It's not really your area of expertise.
Terrible.
Terrible. Really bad.
Well then, how is your grasp of Latin? Because this could be the other way that you could go to the key of success here in this.
So as most of Italian students have been through that for several years during my education, but that was many years ago.
Okay. So Elisa, you might know some of this based on your grasp of Latin, although some years ago. So we'll put you to the test. And obviously those at home, you can have a go as well as to guess what these kind of phobias are. So I found a few phobias online. These are what they're called. And I just want you to take a guess as to what you think they are. So the first one is astrophobia.
No way. It's fear of space or traveling? Something like this?
It is indeed the fear of space. So congratulations on that first one. So a good spot there with the astrophobia. They will get more difficult. I thought that would be a nice one to start with. How about this one then?
Why would you fear space? You should never fear space.
Okay, so this is a really good question, because I actually then tried to find out some information about each phobia. I quickly went onto Google Scholar to see if I could find out about astrophobia. There was no citations. I'm assuming that somebody has named it astrophobia because this is what we do with phobias. We, for some reason, have a principle to name them after Latin. Now, maybe in the future, this will actually be quite a prevalent phobia. Who knows?
So
did you get this from Reddit?
Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, did you find these on Reddit?
No. My academic sources were slightly better than Reddit, but not too much higher than Reddit.
But can we use that as a new research question and try to understand whether there is astrophobia in general or not?
Well, this is exactly. So this is the point, right? So, I mean, assuming we continue to make spaceflight a potential reality for many, astrophobia could be something that becomes reasonably prevalent. So, I'd say that this has just been cutting edge discussion here that in 5 years' time will be incredibly relevant.
Sam, just to clarify myself, I don't really want to be picky, but is the fear to go to outer space, or is the fear that some space object is going to impact you on Earth?
My understanding was it was about the fear of outer space, but who knows? It could be very multifaceted. This quiz is not going very well for me, by the way. This is supposed to put you under the scrutiny, not me. So the next one is now I have some information about these following ones. Barophobia.
Baroreceptor are again related to gravity and where you are in function of gravity. So is gravity phobia? Is phobia about gravitational acceleration?
Yeah, I feel like you're realizing the theme to this quiz here. Fear of gravity is correct. Now, on face value, when I saw this one, I was like, surely that's fundamentally counterintuitive to existence to fear gravity, considering it seems to be very fundamental. So I actually have some information about fear of gravity, if you let me.
But I guess it's not something we think about actively, that we have this 1G, gravitational environment around us.
But it seems to be a very limited research area. But I did find one paper from 1982 by Hall, who talks about barophobia, fear of gravity. And actually, I think it then starts to make a little bit more sense when the way he defines it. So he was talking about it as a way of, first of all, a fear of sort of high places. So there were some people that talked about experiencing like going up in an elevator, or you might think about like a roller coaster, you kind of get those feelings in your stomach. But also then the fear of falling. You don't necessarily have to have both of them. It's just that some may experience fear of falling as a fear, or fear of high places, or maybe both. But he labeled it barophobia. It's some sort of gravitational fear, which I think in some respects, then once you understand it that way, makes a bit more sense.
It's very interesting. Can you pass me the paper, please? I
will pass you the paper. So my third, and I feel like you're understanding the theme, so try this one for size, tripophobia. I have to admit, this is very tenuous, this one.
Iqra, do you have any cue?
Well, I'm thinking 3, but then you said tripophobia.
Tripophobia. I may be pronouncing these incorrectly, so that makes it even harder.
Can we have a hint?
I'm trying to think of a hint that doesn't. I'll give you my hint as to how I thought it linked to space, and it doesn't really link to space at all, to be honest. But there are certain parts of space, particularly, I'm trying to think about how to describe it, but certain features of space seem to have a very, very strong gravitational pull on objects around it. I guess that would be an ambiguous riddle to guess.
The sun, something to do with the sun?
Okay, so now my limited knowledge of physics, but I believe that suns may eventually turn maybe into these. I don't know. Look, this is not, by the way, this is not a physics channel. If anyone's tuning in expecting to get really good physics knowledge, I suggest you go elsewhere. Anyone do you want to take a guess at what this is, and I'll let you out of your misery?
Fear of black holes.
Right. Okay. So you are on the right lines. My tenuous link to space here in the theme was it's a fear of cluster of holes, is an actual phobia. And so I thought space has loads of holes. You've got black holes. If you want to be sci-fi, you've got wormholes. Then, of course, when you think about the moon, there's lots of craters in the moon, which kind of look a bit like holes. So that was my tenuous link to create a theme here. Now, I actually have some information about tripophobia. First of all, actually, I should ask you, is there a particular, this has actually become really prevalent in outside of sort of psychological academic circles, because people are quite familiar with this phobia, because there's a particular type of food that individuals with tripophobia dislike. Now, if I tell you it's clusters of holes, can you think of any food substance that would potentially cause these individuals a slight aversion to?
Some sort of cheese.
Cheese wasn't the one I was thinking of. I'll give you another clue. And again, this is now a culinary cooking channel. We're going through all the motions today. It is a sort of
multidisciplinary.
Sorry, it's multidisciplinary. Yeah, and with culinary ideas. But it's a bread product that is very popular in Britain that you have for breakfast.
Black pudding. Black pudding.
No, it's not black pudding either. It is crumpets, because they have all those little holes. So apparently those individuals have some of them at least anyway, have, that's one thing that they're particularly aversive to. Now, I actually have a paper I looked up, Tripophobia. I'll give you some statistics about it. So Cole and Wilkins in 2013, they looked at tripophobia. Now, what they did was they showed people an image of a lotus seed. Lotus seed has lots of little small holes, and they basically rated people's aversion to that image. Now, obviously, that's not really a standard diagnosis, but they found in their sample that 11% of males reported an aversion to those little cluster of holes, and 18% of females reported a sense of aversion to that photo. Now, obviously, that doesn't necessarily mean they would classify as tripophobic, but nonetheless indicate a level of aversion. Let's do with the last one then. The last phobia I have is ailurophobia.
Can you spell it out?
It's Luro, phobia. So I think it's pronounced Ilurophobia.
Fear of
Phobia
breathing,
of
fear of air.
trees.
Air.
Air, yeah. Fear of
Elisa,
breathing, I don't know.
what did you go for? Breathing. Elisa, what did you go for?
Trees.
Trees. No, it's just the fear of cats. I thought that, well, I'd try and subvert the theme. Once you figured out what the theme was, I thought you'll go for another one which is on the theme of space and gravity, and I'll just throw in a fear of cats in there as a way to...
So fear of cats.
Apparently, I mean, I love cats, so I don't understand this, but some people have a fear of cats. Although I suppose we think about domestic house cats, but it might be lions and tigers, which probably makes a fair bit of sense from an evolutionary perspective. Anyway, thanks very much for taking part in my.
Well, can I just say, we have a lab mascot, which is Neurocat. I don't know if she's here. I don't know if she can make an appearance, but we have a Neurocat.
Yeah, let me get the Neurocat.
Oh, okay. We're getting a final welcome addition to Elisa's cat.
I mean, we should probably give a warning. Anyone who has, a fear of cats should probably leave.
Yeah, by the way, this is your time to leave the room if you have a fear of cats. And it was nice to have you, and I hope to see you next time. But for those of you who do not have an aversion to cats, this is Elisa's cat. Aww.
So the official name is Theodora, but she is also called Neurocat.
Okay. Aww. And I think on that bombshell, it's probably time that we conclude this podcast. So I just want to say again, thank you both of you for taking part. It's been really interesting to learn about, your area of expertise. And I hope you've learned a few things about phobias based on my very poorly constructed quiz.
Thanks so much for having us.
No problem. I hope to have you guys again soon. See you later.
Thank you so much, Sam. See you later.
Bye.
Thank you for watching the Psychology Debrief. If you have any suggestions for new topics, quizzes, or any other content psychology related, feel free to get in touch via email or Twitter. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Bye!